Due to multiple appalling high profile instances of sexual violence this year, the topic of how to teach or socialize men not to be abusive has rightly got a fair deal of attention.
And welcome to Why I Hate Novara Media. And why I hated the year of Sarah Everard's death. So Sarah Everard was murdered. She was young, female, attractive, blonde, and a marketing executive, so that got a huge amount of attention. So for an entire year, the media was nothing but feminist fear-mongering about the extremely small risk of violence against women. And useful idiots like Novara Media happily parroted the idea that women are unusually likely to be victims of violence. All completely untrue, of course. As for socialising men, well, I shouldn't have to say it to a left-winger, but crime is not a sign that you're some sort of privileged group. It's actually a sign of victimisation, almost all violent criminals having themselves been victims of violence in the past. I don't know, what's next? Are we going to talk about socialising black people? But let's see what else he's got to say.
On the topic of sexual harassment, the Office of the Mayor of Greater Manchester released a video on this. It's gone down pretty well on social media. It's gone really viral, 1 million views. Let's take a look.
Is that Andy Burnham? It's pretty alarming that he's one of the best Labour figures we've got right now, to be honest. This video is called How Women Experience Sexual Harassment, and apparently it's through positive remarks on Instagram. If we're talking about online harassment, then men are far more likely to be victims, men are far more likely to have actual threats of violence, men are far more likely to get swatted. But if we're talking about got a BF, then I suppose female victims are more likely. That was someone running past her. Oi,
look at her. Very nice! Yeah, she's alright.
Okay, someone took a photograph. That's something that actually happened. In public. And I won't talk about how many CCTV cameras there are in Manchester. But it is something. It's something which is not nothing.
Yeah, no worries. See you soon. Bye.
Okay, we've escalated now to actual crimes. Which means we've also got to the point where men are more likely to be victims, but I don't expect the government of Greater Manchester to care about that.
Hey, beautiful, give us a smile. Bet you look much prettier when you smile. Hey, don't ignore me. Come on, love. Think you're better than me, yeah? You're not even that fit. What, you're not going to invite me now?
Yeah, you're asking for a dress like that.
Are you off tonight? She definitely wants it.
Oh, he's sexy.
Well, it didn't take long to get back down to people saying things that you don't like. But do you think there's a single man in Britain who hasn't had abuse shouted at him in the street? Maybe even objects thrown at him in the street? You know, someone called me Wagbo once, which is an old cultural reference now, but it was very insulting indeed. Where's my parade, Government of Greater Manchester?
Do you think this is okay?
Those numbers up. Those are rookie numbers in this racket.
No joke, those numbers can be made a lot higher pretty easily. Look at this. You see? Clap your eyes on that. That is exactly the same source, UN Women UK, and it's a different number, because the number is completely fake, and it's pretty easy to fake as well. All you do is you classify sexual harassment to include what they call sexist insults. Now, every woman who's ever been called a bitch is one of the victims. And that immediately gets you huge numbers. And I'm sure that if you flip the sexes, you asked every man, hey, have you ever been called a creep, a loser, a bastard, whatever, an incel maybe, then you'd get a pretty high proportion there as well. But of course, they're not going to do that because that doesn't fit the narrative that they're trying to fake evidence for.
So that video was put out by the office of the mayor of Greater Manchester. So Andy Burnham tweeted it out, but presumably it was made by people in his team.
Andy Burnham's big achievement was bringing some buses under government control, so I suppose demonising men who tell women they're fit is actually a pretty good achievement by his standards.
Ash, that video's got lots of praise.
I thought this was a really good video because the emotions of it rang very, very true.
Yeah, it's a pity really that the facts aren't true. But the music, the bit where she stares into the camera and says, is this okay? It was very clearly designed for emotional manipulation. And on Ash Sharkar, it seems to have worked.
From the things which seem quite micro. So when you're a woman and you're out and about and you see a glance, and it can be just something as small as a glance, which makes you reassess, should I keep walking the way I'm walking? Should I change my route? If I do continue the way I'm walking, is that man going to take it as a sign of like sexual interest on my part? And then how do I diffuse that situation?
It's ironic that women who complain about being sexualized in public will immediately sexualize any man they see. And that is what's happening here. This woman, Ash Sharkar, she's talking about someone glancing at her. And she immediately thinks, oh, so does he want to have sex with me? Does he think that I want to have sex with him? Is he a sexual threat? When the reality is it's just someone walking down the street, but she can't see him as anything other than a sexual being. And this has serious effects, because this contributes to the push for changes in legislation, such as the recent ones that make it illegal to look at a woman in a way that she doesn't like. But the reality is that a glance is not a threat. A glance is not even an expression of sexual interest. This is nothing more than Ash Sharkar being some combination of narcissistic and paranoid in a way that's very harmful to the people around her. And she really does pose a threat. Like, someone glancing at her doesn't, but her belief that they do can lead to her pushing for changes in legislation as a public figure. It can lead to her calling the police and Karening, you know. This is something that actually poses a threat of a type that exists, whereas the threat she perceives doesn't.
And the cumulative impact of having to navigate those kinds of interactions on a day-to-day basis, it is utterly exhausting. And so
having to navigate those kinds of interactions every day is exhausting. Well, firstly, you don't have to, because there aren't actually any interactions there. You know, secondly, that's not an interaction. Someone glancing at you is not an interaction. You're not interacting with them. You're just existing near them. And it doesn't have to be exhausting, because you can just try and pretend that you're not so self-obsessed. Try and pretend that people around you might not want to fuck you all the time. It's pretty simple, really.
I think the way in which this piece of video really locates the emotion in the female experience of those things, I thought was really powerful. And I think that lots of women were saying, yeah, that is how it is. There's a challenge to men who are watching the video. You're asking them, you know, is this okay? And this is where maybe I think...
Well, here's a challenge for women. Man the fuck up, alright? Because if it comes to actual violence, men far more likely to be the victims. Boys, you know, young children, far more likely to be victims than adult women. If it comes to threats of violence, men far more likely to be victims. If it comes even to insults and shouting, men far more likely to be victims. But if we limit our concerns solely to compliments or expressions of sexual interest, then maybe women more likely to be victims. So obviously that's the only thing that Ash Sharkar cares about.
We've gotten to something of like an impasse or like, you know, a blocked off road, because I think that most men watching that would go, of course, no, that's not okay. If not, you know, basically all men would say, of course, that's not okay. But that doesn't necessarily change how they themselves behave when they're out there in the world or interacting with women.
Is that supposed to be an implication that most men are responsible for this sort of behaviour? Because I'll tell you right now, that's not the case. In fact, I could point you to studies showing that most men are too afraid to approach women in case they are perceived as creepy. Even of men not giving women CPR because they were afraid of the consequences it might have for them. So, this idea that most men are being overly sexually aggressive is just ridiculous nonsense. And if we need to change our behaviour, it's only in that we need to stop pretending that we take any of this nonsense seriously.
And I think that we're still struggling to navigate that chasm between the public disavowal of sexual harassment and sexual violence, and that in private or in public spaces where men feel a lack of accountability, that their behavior is very, very different and not in line with the kind of morality that they like to project.
Wow, she's really saying this. She's really saying that men just generally sexually harass women. Like, she doesn't see this as being an outlier thing. She sees this as being more of an action by a sort of male gestalt, as if men are a hive mind who say one thing but then do another. I suppose that's what comes with being a hate-filled bigot. You see the people you hate as being a lump, rather than actual human beings.
Out there to other people, or indeed the kinds of things they might say to, their moms, their sisters, their girlfriends, their friends. Bell Hooks died yesterday.
And they say good things never happen.
And it made me think, watching this video, of one of her books, which is called The Will to Change, which is really about how men are socialized into their masculinity.
Well, let's not even talk about how important socialization is. Let's just point out that she doesn't want to talk about who's doing it. Which is, who does most of the parenting? It's not men. Who has most opportunity to parent? Who gets most of the custody? Who makes up almost all teachers? This is something that she wants to hold little children accountable for, that's being done to those little children by the people that she won't criticise, which are just groups made up mostly of women.
And the two things that happen to men growing up, which is one, they're hurt.
It's true, men get hurt, people get hurt. And when it comes to violent criminals, on average, they've experienced several times as many what are called adverse childhood experiences as the general population. But again, she's putting all of the focus on the young boys who are being victims. Most of those adverse childhood experiences come at the hands of women committing child abuse, women committing sexual abuse. Most rapists in British prisons were sexually abused by women when they were children. That's just a fact. That's what socialisation really looks like, but you know that she's never going to talk about that, because it's really all just about victimising women and villainising men.
And then 2, they're taught to deny their feelings. And then 3, there is the sort of, that comes out in this really weird way of like misogynistic violence, harassment, belittlement, all of these kinds of things.
And again, this is a consistent set of principles that she's shown here. This is the same problem, right? It's always the same problem. It's always look at men as bad, always look at women as good, or more often as victims, and that's just what she's doing. Acting like interaction between the sexes is all about women being victimised by men, and acting like men victimising women is the only victimisation that matters, which it's really just not.
And one of the challenging things that Bell Hooks says is that women are a part of that socialization of men too. We also help uphold some of these patriarchal expectations of men, which then produce misogynistic behaviour.
I've heard relatively good things about Bell Hooks, considering she's a radical feminist, and sounds like she had about 40% of a point there, to be honest. But Ash isn't going to take that any further.
And so I think that this is a great video. I'm really all for it. But what I also want is for us to go beyond thinking of sexual violence, sexual harassment, or misogyny as something which we solve by sharing content that emotionally resonates with us, and we can sort of say something about ourselves by sharing it. And maybe we get into, I think, that really deep down, nitty gritty stuff that Bell Hooks is talking about in terms of, well, what emotional need is being served by the expressions of misogyny or sexual harassment, and how is that related to the way in which men are socialized into their masculinity?
You see, I think we need to start focusing on the crimes that are actually happening, which are overwhelmingly against men, rather than pretending that women are somehow more important. And particularly minor things like street harassment should really just be completely ignored. This is a non-issue. This is the 10,000th most important police responsibility here. I think we should stop demonising masculinity. I think that if we're going to focus on things done by men, need to focus on protecting men and especially young boys, because it is when they have been victims of violent crime that they become most likely to commit violent crime. It's as simple as that, really. New media for a new politics. As if this isn't exactly the same as every establishment media outlet, every establishment political party. Is there any of them that don't care about violence against women? Is there any of them that actually care about protecting boys or anything like that? I mean, that's not the case. And Ash knows. She just doesn't care. Instead, she's too interested in focusing on these ridiculous non-problems of, well-off white women. And that includes privileged minorities like herself. So I'm sure it made her feel better, appealed to her emotions, but yeah, this doesn't do anything positive in terms of actually trying to prevent crime. And if you want to do anything about that, then you really have to focus on men. There is no other option, because men are the majority of victims. And that includes victim offenders, I'm afraid.